In the middle of the 18th century, the 13 British colonies in North America lived under the familiar rhythm of imperial rule. Town squares echoed with church bells, markets hummed with activity, and the Atlantic world bound colonists to a global empire. But beneath this outward sense of order, change was coming, quietly, steadily, and inevitably. Great Britain, exhausted and indebted after the 7 Years' War, turned toward the colonies as a source of revenue. New taxes and trade restrictions, measures rationalized in London as fair contribution, felt, across the ocean, like burdens imposed without understanding. The colonists, who had fought alongside British troops and had considered themselves loyal subjects, began to question the fairness of a government in which they had no representation. In Boston, resistance simmered into open confrontation. Merchants refused taxed goods, assemblies debated their rights, and pamphlets circulated with arguments for liberty. The Boston Massacre in 1770, chaotic and tragic, became a symbol of imperial overreach. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party turned defiance into spectacle, crates of tea crashing into icy harbor waters as the world watched a colony question an empire. Britain responded with the coercive acts, closing Boston's port, tightening control, and asserting Parliament's supremacy. Instead of restoring order, the measures pushed the colonies closer together. Delegates from across North America met in Philadelphia, forming the First Continental Congress. Farmers, lawyers, merchants, ministers, men who had once thought of themselves as British subjects, now debated the unthinkable, collective resistance. By the spring of 1775, tensions burned across New England. British General Thomas Gage prepared to seize colonial weapons, stockpiled and conquered. Local militias, alerted by riders through moonlit roads, prepared to stand their ground. At Lexington Green, as dawn broke, the spark became flame. Shots were fired, uncertain, chaotic, irreversible. The American Revolution had begun. Men who had never imagined themselves as soldiers now faced an empire. As the fighting spread, militias transformed into an army. Farmers, craftsmen, and tradesmen left fields and workshops to take up muskets. Families watched loved ones march into an uncertain future. And in Philadelphia, debates deepened, not only about war, but about identity, liberty, and the possibility of a new nation. George Washington, a tall Virginian with a steady presence, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. Underfunded, poorly supplied, and lacking formal training, the army he led faced enormous odds. Yet Washington carried with him a sense of duty and restraint that would shape both the war and the country to follow. As months turned to years, the revolution expanded from a regional uprising to a global struggle. Diplomats sought alliances, newspapers spread ideas, and enslaved people, indigenous nations, and women experienced the war's impact in ways often overlooked but deeply consequential. The revolution was not a single story, but thousands, woven across battlefields, homes, and political halls. What began as a dispute over taxes now carried the weight of a larger question. Could a people claim the right to govern themselves? The answer, still uncertain, would unfold on muddy roads, silent encampments, frozen river crossings, and the fiery clashes of a war shaped by bravery, strategic missteps, international rivalries, and ideals that would echo through centuries. Tensions escalated quickly after the first bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. What had begun as scattered clashes between colonial militia and British regulars now hardened into something far more serious. Across New England, farmers left their fields, blacksmiths abandoned their forges, and merchants closed their shops. They gathered with an understanding that history had shifted overnight. Ordinary men who had never traveled more than a few miles from home suddenly found themselves marching in defense of an idea still too new to name: liberty. The siege of Boston became the first true theater of war. Colonial forces, loosely organized but fiercely determined, surrounded the city, cutting off British supplies and isolating their troops. Supplies ran thin inside the city, while outside the encampments, life settled into a tense routine. Families visited the hills overlooking Boston, watching smoke rise from camps and listening for the distant echo of musket fire. It was a strange mixture of domestic life and looming war, where every sunrise carried the weight of uncertainty. In Philadelphia, delegates of the Second Continental Congress struggled to make sense of the spiraling conflict. They debated, argued, and hesitated, torn between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to the people who had elected them. Among them, one figure began to rise: George Washington. Tall, reserved, and dignified Washington carried with him the quiet authority of a man shaped by hardship. When he accepted command of the Continental Army, he did so not out of ambition, but out of duty. He wore his uniform not as a symbol of rank, but as a promise. The British, frustrated by colonial resistance, sought to break the siege by capturing key positions around Boston. Their eyes turned to the hills, strategic high ground that would determine control over the city. On a warm June night in 1775, colonial troops moved silently under the cover of darkness, digging fortifications on Breed's Hill. When dawn broke, the British were stunned at what they saw: a makeshift fortress rising from the earth. manned by farmers and laborers armed with little more than resolve. What followed would be remembered as one of the most defining clashes of the early war, the Battle of Bunker Hill. British troops marched in tight formation, redcoats gleaming, muskets ready. Colonial fighters waited behind crude barricades, holding their fire until the enemy was almost upon them. The order, whispered like a prayer, passed through the line. Dawn to fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The first British assault collapsed under the weight of colonial determination. The second broke against a wall of musket fire, but the third charge succeeded, not because of British superiority, but because the colonists had exhausted their powder. Forced to retreat, they left the hill behind, but not their spirit. The British had won the ground, but at a cost so devastating that it shocked their commanders. The colonists had proven they would stand and fight, even against overwhelming force. As news of the battle spread, colonial morale soared. The world began to take notice. In London, debates erupted about the Crown's handling of the colonies. In Europe, rival empires watched with interest, sensing that something profound, something potentially world-altering, was unfolding across the Atlantic. Washington arrived in Boston to a scene of organized chaos. The Continental Army was more an idea than a functioning force, poorly supplied, inconsistently trained, and lacking discipline. But Washington saw potential. He walked the encampments in silence, studying the men who would soon fight under his command. He understood the enormity of the task before him, the transformation of a collection of militias into a unified army strong enough to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. Through months of relentless work, he instilled structure, discipline, and purpose. Soldiers who had once trained with wooden sticks now drilled with real muskets. Officers learned command tactics. Supply lines were organized. Morale rose. Little by little, an army was forged. By early 1776, the British position in Boston had become untenable. American forces brought in captured cannons transported from Fort Ticonderoga under the daring leadership of Henry Knox. The sight of massive artillery placed on Dorchester Heights sent shockwaves through British command. With the threat of devastating bombardment looming, the British evacuated Boston, sailing away as thousands of colonists watched from the shoreline. For the first time, the impossible seemed possible. The colonies had forced the empire to retreat. But even as Boston celebrated, darker skies gathered elsewhere. The British government, outraged and determined, prepared a massive military response. Naval fleets were dispatched. Armies were assembled. Reinforcements would soon arrive in overwhelming numbers, and the war would shift from a regional uprising to a full-scale international conflict. The colonies, still uncertain about independence, now faced a sobering question. If reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible, then what future awaited them? The answer would emerge in the months ahead, shaped by the courage of leaders, the suffering of soldiers, and the emerging belief that a new nation, born of struggle and sacrifice, could stand among the powers of the world. Across the colonies, the war settles into a long and uncertain struggle. Victories are celebrated briefly, but they do little to mask the reality that the Continental Army is under-resourced, under-trained, and constantly on the edge of collapse. Soldiers march for weeks with worn shoes, threadbare coats, and empty stomachs. Payments arrive late, if at all. Families at home struggle with shortages of flour, salt, and tools, while British blockades squeeze trade to a near halt. Yet, despite the hardship, the idea of liberty proves stronger than despair. Town meetings continue. Pamphlets circulate in taverns and marketplaces, urging perseverance. Ministers speak from pulpits about sacrifice and destiny. For many, the war becomes something far greater than a dispute with a king. It becomes a test of whether ordinary people can create a new political order in a world dominated by empires. In late 1777, the conflict reaches a decisive turning point. The British advance from Canada collapses at Saratoga, where American forces surround and defeat an entire British army. The news spreads like wildfire across the colonies. Letters home describe the moment as proof that the Americans are capable not only of resisting, but winning. For the first time, foreign observers take notice. In Paris, diplomats whisper that perhaps the American experiment is not doomed after all. France, long an enemy of Britain, begins to see opportunity. Supplies flow quietly across the Atlantic. Gunpowder, muskets, uniforms, sent not to destroy an empire directly, but to weaken it through the struggle of its rebellious colonies. By early 1778, this support becomes official. France recognizes American independence and commits ships, soldiers, and money. It is a turning point that transforms what began as a regional rebellion into an international war. Meanwhile, Washington's army endures its darkest winter at Valley Forge. Snow covers the encampment, and illness spreads through the ranks. Few armies in history have faced worse conditions. Diaries describe men huddled around small fires, their feet wrapped in rags, their morale hanging by a thread. The camp becomes a symbol of suffering, but also of resilience. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, discipline strengthens, and an army once considered barely functional begins to transform into a cohesive fighting force. Far from the main lines, the war takes on new dimensions. On the frontier, native nations divide, some siding with the British in hopes of halting colonial expansion, others aligning with the Americans. The conflict becomes entangled with older rivalries and long-standing grievances. The violence is brutal and deeply personal, reshaping relationships that had existed for generations. In the South, the British introduce a new strategy. Believing loyalist support to be stronger there, they attempt to rally colonists against the revolutionary cause. The strategy triggers a civil war within communities. Neighbor fights neighbor, families divide, and violence erupts in backcountry regions from Georgia to the Carolinas. The war is no longer a distant political struggle, but a direct and immediate threat to daily life. Despite British efforts, resistance grows. Local militias, familiar with the terrain and fiercely loyal to their communities, strike quickly and disappear just as fast. These small victories complicate British plans, draining their resources and morale. Gradually, momentum shifts. The American cause strengthens, driven by the idea that survival depends not on one great victory, but on persistence. As 1780 approaches, the war enters its final, most decisive phase. British forces, stretched thin across oceans and continents, begin to falter. The arrival of French warships changes the balance of power at sea. The Continental Army, hardened by years of suffering and sacrifice, prepares for the final confrontation. The revolution is no longer simply a conflict of muskets and cannons. It is a struggle over what the future of the continent will look like, and whether a new nation built on principles, rather than monarchy, can survive the test of war. The final years of the Revolutionary War unfolded with exhaustion on every side. Armies were stretched thin, supplies were scarce, and the hope that once ignited rebellion flickered unevenly across the colonies. Yet, momentum slowly shifted. The entry of France brought naval strength, supplies, and confidence the Americans had never possessed before. Global forces now shaped a struggle that began in Boston streets and Pennsylvania fields. In the South, the war took a darker turn. Loyalist militias clashed violently with patriot neighbors, farms burned, towns were torn apart, and entire families found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict they had never wished for. Battles like Camden and Cowpens revealed the brutality and ingenuity of Southern warfare. Commanders adapted strategies, learning to use mobility and knowledge of the landscape as weapons equal to muskets and cannon fire. Throughout these final campaigns, General Washington carried a weight heavier than his uniform. Years of retreat, hunger, and mutiny had tested his army beyond measure. Yet the Continental Army's discipline held. At times, shoes were nothing more than rags. At other times, winter winds cut deeper than bayonets. Still, the soldiers marched, sustained by a fragile belief that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. Then, in 1781, hope crystallized at Yorktown. Washington's northern forces moved silently and swiftly, combining with French armies under Rochambeau. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sealed the bay, trapping British General Cornwallis. What followed was not a single decisive charge, but a siege, calculated, relentless, and coordinated with precision the Americans had rarely been able to achieve before. Day and night, artillery thundered across the fields of Virginia. Earthworks crept closer to British defenses, tightening a circle that would not break. Inside the British encampment, morale collapsed. Supplies dwindled, escape routes vanished, and the booming French guns signaled an end long feared, but now undeniable. When Cornwallis finally surrendered in October, the sound of fifes and drums carried across the battlefield, mourning an empire's defeat in a land it once expected to rule forever. The world had changed. The war did not end instantly. Skirmishes continued, negotiations dragged on, and soldiers waited impatiently for word that they could return home. But something irreversible had happened at Yorktown. A new political reality emerged, one in which 13 colonies would become something unprecedented, something fragile, something audacious, a republic. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the idea of American independence became a legal truth. Yet the nation that stepped into the world was uncertain, fractured, and untested. Veterans returned to farms in ruin, families broken by years of fighting, and communities scarred by war's bitterness. The ideals proclaimed in Philadelphia, the equality of men, the rights of individuals, the promise of self-government, were not yet realities. They were challenges waiting to be built, questioned, and contested. Still, the people who survived the revolution carried with them a shared memory of sacrifice and resilience. They had confronted empire, endured hunger and death, and held to a belief that ordinary individuals could shape their destiny. This memory became the inheritance of a nation. As the revolution ended, the world watched with uncertainty. Could this new republic survive? Could it prove that people, not kings, could govern? Could the ideals written on parchment survive the pressures of politics, ambition, and conflict? No one knew. But the revolution had planted a possibility, and the possibility itself reshaped the world. Across the Atlantic, monarchies saw that their subjects could rise. Across continents, people heard the whispers of self-rule. The revolution was no longer merely an American event. It had become a global signal, an invitation for change, for resistance, for hope. In the years that followed, the United States would grow, struggle, endure conflict, and face profound contradictions. But its birth, forged through sacrifice and uncertainty, would be remembered as the moment when a new idea entered the world stage. Not an idea of perfection, but one of freedom, imperfect, evolving, yet enduring.